Example number 1 says a man with a severed finger is brought to a hospital emergency room. Okay, so if we want to draw his demand for medical care in this particular situation, we start out as we always do with our XY graph where we have quantity of medical care demanded on the x-axis and the price of that medical care on the y-axis. Now, because this is an emergency situation and the guy is probably bleeding quite a bit, he's not going to take his time to shop around and drive from hospital to hospital finding the best deal for getting his finger fixed up. So we expect his demand curve to be very steep, if not perfectly steep. So this is a very inelastic demand curve. Okay. In other words, if we have a really low price of medical care, let's call it price 1, okay, then the man's going to demand this much health care in the particular situation. But if price is way higher up here, the man's not going to decide, oh, well, that's too expensive, I don't need my finger fix, I will just continue bleeding. Therefore, regardless of the price, we expect the quantity demanded to remain relatively unchanged at Q1. Example number 2 says a patient is given a prescription for a drug to control high blood pressure. The patient's insurance doesn't cover drugs, so the patient must pay out of pocket. Before we determine whether this patient's demand for the blood pressure drug is elastic or inelastic, let's start out by drawing our XY graph. On the x-axis, we have the quantity demanded for blood pressure medication, and on the y-axis, we have the price of blood pressure medication. Okay, so now before we draw the demand curve, let's think about whether we want a steep or a more flat demand curve. Okay, a steep curve will represent very inelastic demand for the blood pressure drug, and a flatter demand curve will represent a very elastic demand. Because this particular patient doesn't have drug coverage with his health insurance policy, it means that he'll have to pay the full price of whatever blood pressure drug he ends up choosing. So in this case, we would expect the demand curve for the blood pressure drug to be fairly elastic, meaning flatter as opposed to steeper. The demand curve is elastic. Okay. In other words, if the price for a blood pressure drug is really low, down here, then the patient will buy whatever amount the doctor prescribes. Okay, but if the blood pressure medication is really expensive, the patient might forego taking some of the medication. He just might not take as much as he's supposed to. Maybe he takes a pill every other day instead of every day. Okay, obviously this is not going to make the doctor happy. Okay, so we would see a lower quantity demanded if the drug is really expensive. Thinking about it another way, if it's the case that there are substitute drugs, so perhaps the doctor prescribed a specific blood pressure drug, but there are generic alternatives, then the patient might choose to go with that alternative. Okay, in other words, he's going to take the time to figure out what all his options are, and then he's going to go for the cheapest option that is also effective. The third example says a hospital inpatient has insurance that will pay all charges. What would the demand be like for a nurse-administered pain reliever? Okay, so again, we'll start with our XY axis graph. In this case, the quantity demanded will be the quantity of nurse-administered pain reliever demanded, and on the y-axis we'll have the price of that pain reliever. Okay, now getting a ibuprofen from the nurse at the hospital might be costing the insurance company $5 a pill, whereas you could go to the CVS and get a whole bottle of ibuprofen for that $5. But since the patient herself isn't going to pay that itemized cost, she has no incentive to change her behavior based on the fact that this pain reliever is so overpriced in the hospital setting as opposed to in the market setting. So we would expect her demand for ibuprofen or whatever pain reliever we're talking about to be incredibly inelastic. Okay, in other words, the demand is going to be a very steep vertical curve. So this is inelastic demand. Okay, in other words, if the price is really low, okay, then she's going to ask for this many pain relievers. Okay, if the price is high, she's not going to change her behavior. She's going to ask for the exact same amount of pain relievers. Okay, still Q1. In other words, her demand will be perfectly inelastic, meaning there's zero response in quantity when the price changes. Moreover, if this patient is in a lot of pain and therefore really needs the painkiller, then even if she were paying for each pill herself, we would still expect her demand to be pretty inelastic, because when a person is in a lot of pain, they're not going to walk down to the CVS in order to buy cheaper ibuprofen. The fourth example says a family has a high deductible health insurance policy, so the family pays for primary care office visits out of pocket. If one of their children has an earache, what would their demand be like for an office visit to get this checked out? Now, there are two pieces of information to consider here in determining how elastic their demand for a doctor's visit will be in this situation. Okay, the first is that they have to pay for the office visit themselves. The insurance isn't going to pay for it. And secondly, this is not an emergency medical situation. The child has an earache. It is currently not a serious condition. Okay, so both of these pieces of information mean that the family can afford to take a little bit of time and shop around for the best price office visit. Okay, so they might ask a few different doctor's offices what they're going to charge and then go with the cheapest option. So we would expect a pretty elastic demand curve, meaning not a super steep demand curve. Okay, so this is an elastic demand curve. Okay,